Continuing now with The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. And in this session, we begin Monday, August 5th. Haig arrived at the White House early. He had been through this exercise many times, getting the difficult word out, letting the right people know in the right order so that nobody was needlessly offended. Haig made and held friends that way. He had mastered the mechanics of telling the bureaucratic and political establishments about presidential decisions slightly in advance, giving them enough time to absorb the facts, but not enough to spread them around. Today was delicate. This maneuver called for perfect timing. The new transcript could not be allowed to cause a panic, but its significance must not be lost. That was the key to the two-step plan. The president's degree of culpability had to sink in slowly but deeply. This time, Nixon didn't have a grand gesture in reserve to distract the country or to explain away the obvious. No speech, as with Vietnam, the Haldeman-Ehrlichman resignations, or the release of the edited transcripts. Today, Haig was on his own. It was crucial that warning be given to the 10 Republican supporters on the House Judiciary Committee who had gone to the mat for the president, to the Senate Republican leaders, to key Democratic friends like Eastland and Stennis, to Jaworski, to George Bush, the cabinet, and the hard-pressed White House staff. Haig would handle the staff personally. Reporters would be given the statement and transcript late in the afternoon, time enough to grasp what was in them, but too late to set off a stampede. On the Hill, members could ponder and consult before they went out front or issued any statements. That way, the drama would be played out over a few days. Those who had seen the transcript were of one mind. Even so, Haig couldn't be absolutely sure of the wider response. The consensus of the president's senior staff, Ziegler, Bazart, St. Clair, Price, Buchanan, Birch himself, had often been wrong. The reactions of Wiggins and Griffin might be signs that the matter was clinched. Still, he had to move carefully, preserve his position with the president, and let others draw the conclusions. He would sit tight in the middle and convey his feelings by simply failing to come forward with his usual and expected sort of support of the president. Haig had watched the president weather hurricanes before. Nixon might just pull out of this one. There were hidden resources in the man and immense power in the office. Haig was acutely aware of that. He doubted there was another rallying cry in Richard Nixon, but he couldn't be sure. Even now, he really didn't have any confidence that he knew the president very well. When Bazart arrived at Haig's office very early, George Bush was already there, briefed and somewhat relieved. Finally, there was some one thing the national chairman could see clearly. The ambiguities in the evidence against the president had been tearing the party apart, Bush thought. The three men reviewed the day's plan. Bazart and Dean Birch would lay the situation out that afternoon for John Rhodes. That was sensitive. The press was expecting Rhodes to announce today whether he would assume leadership of the anti-impeachment forces. Haig had warned him off, but it was crucial to take Rhodes's temperature carefully. Haig needed a consensus. The president's friends, certain trusted aides, a few politicians whose motives could not be suspect, must come succinctly to a single conclusion. Haig didn't want his ass out front alone. He didn't want his ass out front, period. There wouldn't be any attempt to strong-arm Rhodes, but Bazart was confident that he could help Rhodes see what was now the only solution. Bush asked to go along. It would have been impolite to refuse. Shortly after 9:15 a.m., Birch, Timmons, Buchanan, Lichtenstein, Clausen, and Richard Moore gathered in Birch's office to be briefed by Buchanan. He described the weekend at Camp David. Price, St. Clair, and he stuck off in one cabin, Nixon in another, and Haig and Ziegler running back and forth with messages. The president saying that the transcript didn't mean what it said, and then the president's senior aides conducting their own investigation of the president to confirm that he had listened to the tape. Buchanan was rubbing his hands, rocking back and forth in his chair, trying to articulate what he felt after almost 10 years of service to Richard Nixon. He brooded about how hard he and the others had worked on the defense, how he had persistently maintained that the old man was a victim, not without his faults, but a victim. Buchanan seemed on the verge of boiling over again. The old man had lied to him and everybody else. He had connived. The president had listened to the tape 3 months earlier, in May. He had known since then that it confirmed the worst suspicions, and he had canceled the proposed compromise with Jaworski because of it. The family, Julie in particular, was pressuring the president not to resign. But Buchanan was clear in his own mind. It was over, he said. He called down to the legal offices for a copy of the transcript. Jeff Shepard was shaking when he went off to the Xerox machine. "This is it," he told Ann Morgan, Gergen's assistant. They found the smoking gun. Then he took the copy up to Birch's office and read it aloud. When Shepard had finished reading, Clausen said to Lichtenstein, "Unfortunately, there isn't a market for right-wing journalists." The group had never organized strategy effectively. Now they could at least register its collapse. "Somebody get the ice," Birch said. Someone got the scotch. To the president, Timmons toasted. It was a perfectly serious moment. Hail and farewell. Soon Timmons was on the phone. "Come on over. We're writing resumes," he said to one of his assistants. Briefly, Timmons worried about whether Haig had contacted all the key people. "Dean, does Bush know about the transcript yet?" "Yes." "Well, what did he do?" "He broke out into assholes and shit himself to death," Birch replied. In his Houston law office that morning, Leon Jaworski was told that General Haig was on the line. Jaworski was in Texas to arrange his finances. Now that he was on a considerably reduced government salary of about $40,000 a year, he wanted to move some of his money around for income tax purposes. Haig was less than forthright. He described the new transcript, claiming that neither he nor the lawyers had known it existed until just now. "It came as a shocker," he said. St. Clair got on the line. "It's got to be turned over. I've made contrary representations to the House Judiciary Committee." Jaworski heard their nervousness, particularly St. Clair's. The president's attorney was not only informing the special prosecutor, he was protecting himself, getting it on the record that he had insisted on release. In 7 months of dealing with St. Clair, Jaworski had concluded that the Boston lawyer was overrated. It was clear that he lacked information and was not in control of the Nixon defense. Jaworski had come to regard him as simply another component of the White House public relations machine, another side proclaiming presidential innocence. The new tape was not a surprise. Jaworski had expected something like it. It sounded harmful to the president's defense, but there had already been so much. He saw no reason to rush back to Washington. The president returned from Camp David by helicopter at 10 o'clock. As he was landing, Ziegler sent Connie Gerard to Price's office to pick up an envelope, instructing her not to read what was inside. In any case, Price had taken the unusual precaution of sealing it with tape. She took the package to Stuart Stout in the usher's office in the residence, and he delivered it to the president. It contained Price's 8-page fourth draft of the afternoon statement. As the president was reviewing it, St. Clair called McCahill into his office. It was about 11 a.m. "The June 23rd tape has some very damaging stuff on it," St. Clair said. He told him the details. McCahill agreed it was bad. "Do you think I ought to resign?" St. Clair asked. McCahill was taken aback. The young lawyers on the team often joked about bombshells making direct hits on their bunker. "I'm getting out of here," one would say to another. Sometimes they joked that the special prosecutor was going to name Bazart as an unindicted co-conspirator. But St. Clair was deadly serious. He was telling his associate that their client had withheld evidence. McCahill was trying to think. His first reactions to difficult disclosures had always been, "Okay, how do we explain it? Where's the justification? Let's look at it." Oddly, St. Clair and McCahill had never discussed whether they thought the president was innocent. They were busy lawyers. They had just pushed on with the defense. McCahill used to say to St. Clair that working in the White House was like shaving in the dark. He had gone so far as to urge St. Clair to ask the president what defense he thought they should deploy, since he knew the facts and the lawyers were only speculating. but St. Clair had reminded him that the president had other matters to deal with than building a legal defense, and McCahill had accepted the rules. Now his boss was asking whether he should resign. McCahill said no, not under the circumstances. In an ordinary case, perhaps, but St. Clair's resignation would leave the president without a lawyer. McCahill would, of course, resign too if St. Clair did, and so probably would the rest of the legal staff. The President of the United States might not be able to get a lawyer. St. Clair, still holding back details of the statement drafted for Nixon, mused that he might be able to get the President to say publicly that the lawyers had not been aware of this new evidence. McCahill wondered out loud if the President was going to resign. As far as I know, St. Clair said, we're going to trial in the Senate. Well then, McCahill replied, I have work to do. He wanted to attempt a full analysis of the transcript, but before that he had to go to Sirica's courtroom once again. Benvenisti wanted to subpoena the secretaries who had transcribed some of the tapes to determine if there were any more gaps. On the flight back to Washington that morning, Senator Robert Griffin was pondering the impact, if any, of his Saturday letter. Not enough, he decided, and he got out his yellow legal pad and a blue felt-tip pen. At 11:30, after attending a closed Rules Committee hearing on the procedures that would govern the Senate trial, Griffin read his statement to reporters on Capitol Hill. He spoke in a low, somber voice. I think we've arrived at a point where both the national interest and his own interest would best be served by resigning. It's not just his enemies who feel that way. Many of his friends, and I count myself one of them, believe now that this would be the most appropriate course. Needless to say, this would be an awesome and very difficult decision for him to reach, but I believe he will see it that way too. The number 2 Republican in the Senate had called for resignation and had predicted that the president himself would agree that it was the best course. At the White House, the daily briefing was already 2 hours overdue when Gerald Warren entered the press room at 1 p.m. to announce that there would be another 2-hour delay. Ziegler called his staff into his small office. Diane Sawyer, Jerry Warren, Judy Johnson, Connie Gerard, Karen Nordstrom, and Frank Gannon. I just want to tell you guys what's happened. His manner was calm, cool, sad, but not apologetic. We are going to put out some material this afternoon that some of you will be shocked by. You'll be typing a statement by the president. Accompanying it will be 3 transcripts of presidential conversations. His tone was formal. There is a problem because while Mr. St. Clair was making certain statements, the president acknowledges he knew otherwise about what Mr. St. Clair was saying. All I can think about why this has happened this way is that the president didn't focus on the entire problem. Each one of you can draw your own conclusions as to what it means. I firmly believe that the president forgot he had said that and forgot that he had heard that tape. A lot of people would be calling for the president's resignation, Ziegler said, and many in the White House would be disappointed and hurt. Ziegler himself had personally agonized over the situation, but he recognized that a president could have human frailties. A 61-year-old man with a lot of responsibilities could listen to a tape and not discuss it because he did not want to focus on it or on its implications. Judy Johnson was crying. We'll have no more tears, Ziegler said. We'll be professional and do our job like we always have. He asked that they hold the information confidential until it was released. Ann Greer had left the White House to look for a record during her lunch hour. When she came back, the press offices were empty and Ziegler's door was shut. When everybody finally emerged, Greer had trouble finding out what had happened. Diane Sawyer was saying, "My God, I can't believe all this is in here. Can you believe it?" She told Greer that Ron would see her privately in a few minutes. But Ziegler got tied up and Greer went back to Sawyer. A June 23rd transcript was going to be released, Sawyer explained, and it was bad. What is so bad about it? What is so bad about it is that the president said something on the tape and he has been letting St. Clair go out and say one thing which he knows is not so. Ron's explanation is that the president was too beat to understand what he heard and he wasn't focused on what St. Clair was doing. Greer thought, well, the president is a little bit guilty, but certainly not as guilty as some people think. But Karen Nordstrom interjected, what bullshit. Does he really expect us to believe that? Does he really expect us to believe this? Soon the president's statement had been mimeographed and the transcript retyped on bond paper to be Xeroxed. Johnson, Greer, and Nordstrom fanned out to the Xerox machines. The delay in the briefing had alerted the press. and more reporters were arriving at the White House. The press room was jammed, the overflow group spilling onto the lawn in front of the West Wing entrance. Several reporters lay on the grass, which was forbidden. Tom DeCare thought the press was waiting for blood. Reporters were flouting regulations and decorum because they sensed the end. Ziegler reassured him. They had had tough times before and had made it through. There was no mention of resignation. Warren had almost stopped functioning. Ziegler told him that the problem now was to help the president survive his personal anguish. John Rhodes stayed home. The cover story for delaying his press conference was that he was ill and it would be best to play it through. Wiggins had called him at about 8:30 that morning to describe the contents of the tape. A number of reporters visited Rhodes's house to try to get a statement. CBS correspondent Leslie Stahl rang the doorbell, and Rhodes's wife answered. She thought Stahl was the Avon lady. About 1:15 p.m., Bizart, Birch, and Bush arrived at Rhodes's home. Bizart told the minority leader they had a little bomb, little but highly explosive. Rhodes's wife, Betty, served iced tea because it was too early for the scotch Rhodes felt like having. They sat down in the living room, and Rhodes read the excerpts. There was a brief silence as he laid the sheets aside. This is incredible. Yes, Bizart agreed. It was to me, too. This means that there's just no chance in the world that he's not going to be impeached, said Rhodes. In fact, there's no chance in the world that I won't vote to impeach him. Bizart sighed his relief. I certainly can understand that, Birch said. You know, Rhodes continued, it'd be better to get this thing over to the Senate just as rapidly as possible, because there's no profit to the country or anybody in dragging this out in the House. If you've got any chance at all, which I doubt, it's over in the Senate. After the beating he had taken several months earlier when he had suggested that the president resign, Rhodes was not about to mention resignation again, even in private, even to the president's closest assistants. The three men left satisfied. The consensus was taking hold. Rhodes later let it be known that he was offended that Bush had been briefed before he was. At 3 p.m. in room H-138 of the House of Representatives, the Judiciary Committee Democrats caucused. Rodino announced that he hoped the impeachment debate on the House floor would begin in 2 weeks, on August 19th. He proposed 75 hours of general debate. At 3:30 p.m. across the street in the office of Leslie C. Aarons of Illinois, the number 2 House Republican, the president's defenders on the committee met at Timmons' invitation. St. Clair and Timmons were beginning their briefing when Bizart and Birch arrived. This audience knew the case intimately, so the effect of the new transcript was immediate. Their reactions ranged from outrage to dismay. Their calls for specificity now held a terrible irony. St. Clair defended himself to them. He had been ready to resign if the president had opposed release, he said. St. Clair failed to mention that he had learned of the new evidence on July 24th, the day the Judiciary Committee debate had opened on television. The congressional defenders focused their anger on Nixon. St. Clair, Bizart, and Timmons moved on to Scott's office for a meeting with Senate Republican leaders. Scott, Griffin, Tower, Brock, and Norris Cotton of New Hampshire. Scott's office was decorated as a sitting room, with a desk stuck off in a corner, Oriental art on the walls, and small Chinese figurines on the mantel. A large chandelier hung from the high ceiling. The senator sat stiffly on gold brocade couches while St. Clair told them that once again he was the bearer of bad news. Scott interrupted. He was worried that the White House was trying again to divide the Republicans and asked if John Rhodes had been informed. He became slightly less suspicious when told that Rhodes knew. The clock on the mantel showed just after 4 p.m. St. Clair was watching it. He said he had a new transcript that was bad and it was being released publicly right at that moment. Copies were handed around. St. Clair said that he had insisted it be released. I told the president that if it weren't, he'd be minus a lawyer. No one said anything as the 5 senators read. I've had a problem as a lawyer whether I could continue as the president's lawyer, St. Clair said when they had finished. But as long as he released it, he has done his part, and I can continue to do my best to make a defense. He had thought he had the case won until this last tape, he said. Where? Scott inquired. The other senators, especially Tower, echoed his doubt. St. Clair didn't really answer. He had heard from Haig that senatorial skepticism about Watergate was a localized infection in and around Scott's office. The senators were not nearly as familiar with the case as the Republican members of the House Judiciary Committee, but the transcript's significance couldn't be missed. "This changes the picture one more time," Scott said. The meeting ended politely. Scott thought it odd that the White House representatives hadn't even tried to defend what was on the tape. While Bazart, St. Clair, Timmons, and Birch were on the Hill, about 100 White House staffers assembled in a fourth-floor auditorium in the EOB. Chuck Wardell had been instructed to summon Haig when the room was filled. Every seat was taken, and people stood in the aisles. Haig was delayed because he was still notifying the cabinet members. Housing and Urban Development Secretary James Lynn had been tracked down in the barber shop. The staff members in the EOB were silent as Haig entered half an hour late. The blue curtains were closed behind him as he stood on a podium speaking into a microphone. There was the clipped, efficient ring of the general in his voice. And we're going to end this session right there, leave you with a cliffhanger, and we'll begin the next session right here smack in the middle of the chapter titled Monday, August 5th, 1974, and we'll begin with Alexander Haig speaking to this audience, about 100 White House staffers assembled at the EOB. So we'll stop right there, take up next time. Again, we're on Monday, August 5th, 1974, and we're getting very close to the end of the Nixon presidency. In the final days, by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Thank you for watching.